Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. Today we're playing the Morat Aggression Force versus Svalarheima's Winter Force, and the scenario is Unmasking. Now, Morats are a faction that has been on my list of factions to get back into in N5, basically since release of the edition. I have played Morats across every edition that I've played. I played them in N3, both pre and post update, played them in N4, and I very much wanted to get into them in N5 because in some ways they are familiar, but in many ways in N5, Morats are forced to be quite different. Now, the fundamentals are still there. You have the many viable link teams, you have veteran, now warhorse, across the entire faction. You have an interesting mix of technologies. But in terms of underlying rules and how they affect Morats, Morats are fairly significantly affected by the change to fire teams. Now, the accessibility of duos and duo-based teams for Morats is quite nice, but Morats, for basically all of their history, have been very used to getting +3 ballistic skill from one of their fire teams at some point during the game. Whether that was an N3 heavy fire team that you would build running things like Suriats backed up by Kornak, or whether it was an N4 mixed fire team, where you had a little bit of link soup ultimately that was serving to give +3 ballistic skill to a Yaugat or a Suriat or both. Even if, particularly post-rework, you could play Morats as a many small fire teams faction, the base of the faction's strongest gunfighting was getting that ballistic skill 15, ballistic skill 16 on pieces like the Yaugat and the Suriat, and having that serve as just a relatively comfortable active turn piece. And that is gone now. You cannot get more than +1 ballistic skill from a fire team. A trooper has to be good enough basically to gunfight by on their own to serve as a platform for +1 special die and then maybe +1 ballistic skill. And that, in combination with balance updates, has forced not a rethink of how Morats fundamentally play, but what a Morat list looks like. And so, as at this game, I am 3 games deep into Morats now. I've played a couple of iterations of different lists. And this one that we're seeing here today in this game is what I have settled on as kind of a personal favorite. I feel like it can basically play any mission if it absolutely has to. I feel like it has a little bit of flex in it if you need to adjust based on personal preference, but this is a list that I can more or less recommend and have really, really enjoyed playing. So running through it from top to bottom, we are starting with a Rodok Haris. Now, if you ever want to tell how old a Morat aggression player is, or how long they've been playing Infinity for, ask them if they remember Rodok being good, because that is some carbon dating by the standards of Infinity players. But for all things, there are a season, and Rodok for me are kind of back in force here. Now, these are still just ballistic skill 12 single wound troopers, but noting that they're ballistic skill 12 single wound troopers, the super jump rules have now settled into probably their final form, and although there was a period in which I did not get to play them, where a Rodok could move 16 inches in an order, they can still now do a pretty tasty 7-inch jump followed by a 4-inch move or do some special stuff or whatever, and the two profiles we have here are fairly attractive ones. Firstly, we have a Burst 3 Thunderbolt plus Heavy Pistol, Rodok or Morat standard at this point, which means in a fire team you have effectively basically a Spitfire with HMG or throwback range bands, which coming in at 23 points and 0 SWC on an element with the mobility of a Rodok is quite appealing. And then, especially appealing, we have the secondary profile here in this team, which is the Hacker Rodok. One of the things Morats can do now, and which is present in this list, is comfortably run 2 or even 3 hackers, all of which are regular hackers with Warhorse, which is a very nice ability on hackers, and which have Trinity. And so even though this list is like Dick It's All Willpower 13, this is a serviceable info war list. In fact, I would say that in many respects, this is a good info war list. Through any given repeater that this list puts out, and it has 2 pitches, you can respond with an absolute suite of info war responses back, whether it is triple Trinity in ARO, triple Spotlight in ARO, triple Oblivion in ARO, some mix thereof, and of course active turn. And when it comes to active turn hacking, the Rodok is actually one of the better ones in this link because, among other things, it's BTS 6. Now, the little secret sauce, and one of the last changes I've made to this list, is the addition of the Krakot Renegade to this fire team. Now, Krakot are a unit that I have very fond memories of its release way back in N3. When it came out in N3, these were like, wow, that's incredible value for what you get. And they've kind of fallen by the wayside more or less since then, mostly because Datarazi got a hell of a glow up and have maintained that glow up over multiple editions. Okay, I could still take a 14-point Datarazi. Why am I not taking one over the Krakot? And the reason why is, well, I do have a Datarazi in this list, but more importantly, the Krakot links with the Rodok. It's just part of the Haris team. And having that Rodok fire team move around, take long range shots with the Thunderbolt, do specialist stuff with the Rodok, having the Krakot just move up the field incidentally, usually from a forward deploy position, and moving very quickly because the Krakot has super jump, and so even without any meta chemistry changes, is moving 8 inches on the first jump and then a 2-inch move, just gives you a very solid close assault piece that can be used as part of the mobility of this team up the field. And in every game I have played this fire team, which is not obviously a ton of games at this point, the Krakot has just been useful. It's just been a 14-point dude that is had in some capacity traded up. He's stabbed people, he's shot off chain rifles, and if he needs to come around the corner at close range, that heavy pistol, if it needs to be, is effective burst 4 when you factor in the special die. He's just really solid, and then has a little bit of high roll potential with the random meta chemistry. The first time I used him, he rolled a 20, at which point he was Fizz 16 with regeneration. Now, because this is me, he failed the only regeneration roll that he made, but still, in the course of doing that, he took out a Noctiva. And so this is just one of those like little dudes for 14 points that is doing his best and has consistently traded up. I have really enjoyed him as part of the little Rodok kill team. We then have another 3-person team. By the way, this list is running 2 Haris teams and a duo and a core, but the core will be 3 people. So this is a Suryat, multispectral visor, HRL, multi-pistol, Tinbot firewall, a Kaitok Assault Regiment, just the cheapest one with the chain rifle and the heavy pistols, and then a Dartok, the first of 2. This is more of a classic link team. This is the kind of thing that I would use in N4. I'm still using it, it's quite good. However, I will note one of the points of flex here, depending on the mission, you could make a couple of cuts elsewhere in the list and potentially turn the Kaitok into something that is a bit more mission focused. I like having just a relatively cheap brick wall to put on like deployment zone guard duty, for example, and he will be able to make sort of close assaults for the purposes of the regiment. He's broadly just an efficient 19-point piece if you need to do some wound trading. But because that is not an essential role in most lists, if, for example, you wanted to replace him with a Rindak paramedic, for example, you could make some cuts elsewhere and make that change and swap that in and not really lose anything and get a very cool paramedic into the list. The Dartok is the first of 2. There are 2 linked Dartoks in this list, which means there are 2 linked pitchers, 2 more hackers with KHD, Trinity rules. Just generally a very solid and useful piece. We then have a T-drone, a missile launcher. Now, okay, I'm not a big fan of guided missile play in N5. I don't think it's incredibly strong, but one of the things I want this list to be able to do is yeet out pitches, take spotlight AROs and have those spotlight AROs be live. I want to be able to play that part of the game, but kind of more importantly, as we look through this list, we are running really lean on SWC with a lot of our pieces. We have a 0 SWC Thunderbolt. The Rodok hacker is also 0 SWC. Our lieutenant has a very big gun, we'll get to him in a moment, but he's only half an SWC. And all of that allows us the luxury of having a list that has 4 serviceable big/long range/useful SWC style weapons, but still fit this hacking package and still have SWC left over for the guided missile launcher. Now, would I cut the guided missile launcher if I needed the SWC elsewhere? Yes, absolutely. Not married to it at all, do not think it's essential. But having it, in some circumstances, is a little bit of an out, and the really important thing is that it makes no imposition on this list. The opportunity cost is 16 points. I could replace it with a Datarazi, but I have the SWC available, which is incredibly rare in a Morat list compared to N4. Right? It's a luxury that we can enjoy now that we really couldn't ever in any previous edition. So that's kind of cool. We then have a small Osnat Gaki team, Osnat and 2 Gakis, very, very cheap. 23 points for 3 regular orders, perfectly serviceable, and it is linked smoke. It's also a linked assault element. These things can move very, very quickly from a standing start if they need to. The Osnat is 6'4", the Gakis are 6'6". Now, Gakis are not going to beat anything in close combat. In fact, they're basically useless at everything. Their main purpose is to be 4 points. They were frankly hit quite hard by the Berserk changes, but if you throw down some smoke and run these things forward, and you can get the Osnat into close combat with something, well, she's not going to do a ton of damage with that shock CCW, but she will be able to roll 3 dice, and 3 dice on CC21 is enough to reliably win face-to-face rolls and force multiple saving throws through, usually. And so if you just need to spend a bunch of orders and gank one thing, she can do that. Mostly though, she is linked smoke. And the smoke grenade launcher there is the reason why I'm taking her, because there are very forgiving range bands on that, and 2 dice on 11s is good enough to get that smoke down. Now, moving on into Combat Group 2, we have a Yaugat and a Dartok. I would note it would be nice to have this Yaugat be the sniper instead, but doing so in this case would have been making some cuts I wasn't really willing to make, and the Spitfire is fine. This team will move forward at some point during the game, it'll lay down some pitches with the Dartok, and at some juncture it will get the opportunity to do some smoke shooting with that Yaugat, and the burst advantage of the Spitfire, right, it has one more shot than the Yaugat sniper. It will suffice to put something like a Thunderbolt total reaction into the dirt through smoke, and that's all I really want from this. You could exchange that Yaugat for potentially some other kind of firepower piece, but the only two options you have that come in cheaper than the Yaugat are the Kaitok heavy rocket launcher, which is not nearly going to be as likely to win a face-to-face roll, or then we're getting right down into the dregs where we have the Morat Vanguard heavy machine gun. Now, I actually don't hate the Morat Vanguard heavy machine gun, and I will experiment with it at some point. It is a full 6 points cheaper than the Yaugat Spitfire, and that genuinely does buy certain advantages, and as far as pieces go, it still fits the bill of will put down a Thunderbolt total reaction bot, but I'm not quite willing to go that far with this list just yet. We then have obviously our second Dartok, and then one of the little bits of secret sauce in this list. We have the Sogarat Lieutenant. Now, anyone who's looked at Morats in N5 has looked at these and gone, yep, that's pretty good. I'm not being revolutionary here in suggesting that they are pretty good. But what is really significant, especially if you are an N4 and N3 veteran, is we're free of the tyranny of Kornak. Now, Kornak is still a fantastic lieutenant. There are not many lieutenant +1 orders in the game with Strategos, and he has that. He is the cheapest lieutenant, I think, that gives you that many orders that are fully flexible, but he's still not cheap. If we compare his price, right, he is only 14 points cheaper than a Sogarat, and a Sogarat is basically a tag. Like, it is very, very close to being a tag. It is Armor 6, BTS 6, 2 wounds with no wound incapacitation, has ballistic skill attack -3, and a Feuerback +1 burst. And on top of that, it has a Disco Baller, which gives us some Eclipse in the faction, which otherwise was gated behind Arasiat. Now, I will be honest, the first time I used the Sogarat in N5, he took 2 wounds trying to kill a diplomatic delegate. That was kind of a grim game. But since then, I have persevered with him, shifted where he is in combat groups, changed my expectations for him, and I am now at a point where, yep, he is performing according to spec, and in this game, he's going to absolutely perform to spec. This is a piece I can genuinely recommend, and one of the big changes to Morats, among other things, enabling hacking and missile play in a list that still has 4 good guns. We then have a Dadarazi. You should have a Dadarazi. Dadarazi are very good. And finally, an Ikadron. Now, the Ikadron, firstly, it's like the only model in this entire list that is not here to do violence. Everything else can fight in some capacity if it absolutely has to. The closest other things would be like, well, the Gaki are kind of order generators, but they will get into close combat if I needed them to, and I can even yeet them off into the sunset if I need them to. The Ikadron is here because Repeater and Baggage are both useful to this list, but I would really make the note, I have not at any point so far reloaded in any way that is meaningful. Because the Dartok are linked, they are quite accurate with their pitches. They will usually get those pitches where you need them to. And because you have 2 Dartok, you really aren't in a position where you absolutely need. Like, if you need pitches out, without the Ikadron, you will still get them out. The Ikadron is just a little bit of a luxury. Frankly, it is mainly there because I anticipate that at some point I'm going to need to play a game where I reload the Sogarat's Disco Baller. However, you could absolutely trim that Dartok down into another Gaki, or a Praetor, or even an R-Drone, and if I turned the Ikadron into an R-Drone, I would have enough points to turn the Yaugat Spitfire into a Sniper. That's a change you absolutely could make, for example. It is something that I will tinker with in future, although generally that Yaugat Spitfire gun is something I'm going to flex with a little bit anyway. So, overall, this is a list that after a few false starts, I am really happy with. If you are a Morat player with some tinkering, right? Like, you could consider cutting that Spitfire for something else, maybe make that Ikadron into R-Drone, Spitfire into Sniper change, but broadly, this is a list that is working very much how I want it to work. It can play lots of different ways in the game, and it is doing that wonderful thing where it basically has like 13 or 14 troops that are all there to fight. And I really like when lists do that, because it means that even if you sustain some attrition, you still have able pieces present to prosecute an offense and do the scenario, and that's really cool. It also has tons of visibility control, like lots of hacking. It just kind of does all of the things I want it to do. I really like this list. Now, playing against us today, we have Svalarheima's Winterfor, and this is a little bit of a spin on what is otherwise basically a very good and standard Svalarheima Winterforce list. The only thing in here that is like kind of not even particularly controversial, just a choice, there are 2 things that are worth pointing out. Firstly, this list is running a Varg fire team. Now, there are a number of small to medium fire team options that you can quite ably pursue in Svalarheima Winterforce. Fusilier and Kahu. Kahu are the big thing that is kind of obviously missing from this list, but it's obviously missing for a reason. This list does not need NCOs in it. Kahu, nevertheless, are excellent, but Varg are not bad either. And in particular, what the Varg are kind of adding here is 1. Super Jump is a good skill. 2. Albedo, although situational, is a fairly useful skill. 3. The Varg as a link basis are a very natural home for Shona because all of them share Super Jump, right? Whereas if you tried to pair Shona Karano with a fire team built around Kahu, you would have conflicting mobility skills. And then 4, sometimes you just need a Disco Ball. And if you want access to Eclipse Smoke in Svalarheima Winterfor, you have 2 options, and one of them is a Boig, which I don't actually think is necessarily bad, but is a little bit more difficult to fit easily into lists. The other is that Varg Forward Observer. So we have that fire team, and then we have 2 Locusts, 1 regular hacker and 1 killer hacker. Now, this is probably less standard. This is the least standard part of this list by Svalarheima purposes, and this is really just, this is a recognition of this scenario. We are playing Unmasking. Locusts enjoy a temporary marker state in N5, and you can use the KHD to recamouflage itself or re-cybermask itself. But more importantly, they are somewhat forward deploying in this scenario. There is an exclusion zone, hacker specialists who can go after and kill the HVTs in this scenario. These are mission pieces. Do I personally like the idea of spending 64 points on mission pieces? Well, I would say I am mixed on it. I think they are worthwhile to experiment with. I think Ballistic Skill 12 Breaker Combi Rifles with Mimetism 6 are actually serviceable enough gunfighters that you can get some ancillary use out of these in that respect. I think if they didn't have the marker state that they have in N5, I would be absolutely down on them, just as we all were for every previous edition. But now that they have single-use camouflage and very good Mimetism, making them difficult to discover on the way in, I think they're still expensive, but I'm willing to contemplate this. And there is just enough flex in a Svalarheima Winterfall list to include a bunch of the other really nice pieces that we will see here and still growth of these. Would it probably be better if maybe one of these was a Kahu with a Flareback, and then we found some points and we got some Fusiliers in there for a Fusilier Kahu fire team, just for another good fire-based weapon? Yes, probably. But in terms of especially playing Unmasking and being able to aggressively prosecute the mission, not a bad choice, a little bit of a controversial one. Otherwise, this is a Svalarheima list. What do we see? Machinist, Palbots, multiple Fugazi drone bots. We mentioned the Varg and Shona list. A Beast Hunter, Lankai. Lankai and Svalarheima list. I know, I'm as shocked as you are. And then, oh look, it is our old friend, the Jotun Lieutenant, and a Tech Bee. And then a Warcore and 2 Fugazi drone bots to round out that combat group. This second combat group I particularly like. It has 2 specialists to spend orders if there is no need for the Jotun to do anything, and the Jotun if there is a need for the Jotun to do anything. Now, part of why I think there is a strong argument for a Kahu in this list is that as it stands, the Jotun and the Varg are the only long-range guns. The Jotun is very, very capable. The Varg is a bit more situational thanks to the fact that it's relying kind of on albedo, hoping that is useful, and otherwise the Varg is playing for positioning using super jump to take advantageous fights. If you need to do rampart sweeping, the Jotun is the only weapon that you have, and a second weapon would be very nice. However, this is a list that has access to Eclipse, and a Svalarheima list with Lankai and Shona Karano and Eclipse can theoretically kill basically anything that might be within striking range of any of those pieces. It would probably be good to have one of those Fugazi be a Mulebot instead. It wasn't in this particular case. Because if you're relying on Eclipse that much, then you really do want to be able to reload it. But for at least one turn, thanks to the fire team bonuses, that Varg is going to be able to block line of sight to wherever it needs to go and unleash one of those melee experts, and that's good, basically. That's a good thing to be able to do. Probably not so much, I mean, in Unmasking, on the last turn going after a particular piece, if you finally identified the relevant HVT, yes, very high value, but especially in scenarios like Armory, for example, having that as a surge in, stab everyone in range, occupy the Armory zone, that's like very, very valuable as capability. So overall, this is a list that could use like 1 or 2 tiny tweaks. The Locusts are very expensive, particularly 2 of them, but otherwise it has many things going on that I think are interesting. And with that said, let's see how it played. Now, Willpower 13 versus Willpower 13 Lieutenant roles. My opponent wins and elects to go first, a fine choice in Unmasking. And I have elected to deploy second on the right side of the table as we can see it here, just because there are maybe one more useful places to hide high value targets and maybe very slightly easier access to the consoles, but it's a fairly close run thing. I did consider it to be the better deployment zone, but not by a long way. Now, my opponent is going to reserve drop the Jotun, quite obviously. I'm going to reserve drop the Soggerat, also quite obviously. Let's run through kind of terrain and then deployment. Firstly, in terms of terrain, a lot of single level buildings, we are not playing these as having interiors, but there is one central building in the middle of the table that has an interior space, and in fact, it's the garage which is concealing a button. Now, it's also doing a very important thing in terms of terrain. If you are familiar with like my philosophies about how to set up an infinite table, its main purpose from a terrain function is to be taller than all of these other buildings. One of the phenomenon that you can have occur when you're setting up a table if all of the elevated terrain is the same height is that very little blocks line of sight between elevated terrain and elevated terrain, and so the top level of the battlefield becomes an absolute shooting gallery. By having this big central large line of sight blocking thing, like it's not blocking line of sight to a huge amount of the battlefield, but is enough to just break up sight lines between the high ground and give us two meaningful areas like levels of elevation, each of which has meaningful axes of movement, and mobility games can be played. It's not just, well, whoever has a big gun on the high ground controls the high ground. I like that a lot. Now, in terms of deployment, not that much that's really critical to discuss about my opponent's deployment. We do have the Shona and Varg team hunkered down here behind this building. They will be ready to either jump up onto the rooftop or move out and around as needed. Lang Kai is lightly forward deployed behind this car here, where he will unfortunately remain for the entirety of the game. The Locusts are very aggressively deployed. One is deployed here, ready to move up through the building if needed, right on the 16-inch line, and the other is likewise right on the 16-inch line here, able to move forward to a doorway that will take it up to the roof and to be able to press this button on the rooftop here. Now, putting it in this position is somewhat risky because it is in the open, but there's not really going to be anything I can do to contest that because I look at my opponent's deployment and I go, I can't see any Willpower 13 lieutenant candidates, and I see that you've deployed a machinist and 3 palbots. Gosh, I wonder, what could your reserve drop be? And knowing that there is a Jotun in reserve, nothing is safe to put as an ARO piece. There is no piece in my list except the Soggerat under good circumstances that can contest the Jotun at long range. And so until the Jotun is deployed, nothing is going as an ARO element. Because nothing is going as an ARO element, my opponent is basically banking on that, and this Locust is therefore fairly safe if aggressively positioned. Otherwise, there are Fugazi John bots scattered around and a war correspondent up here on this roof in an ARO position. Warcore, 3 points, Flash Pulse, 3 points to waste one or more of your opponent's orders on a critical turn. They're reasonable enough use. I will sometimes put them in a somewhat more reserved spot, but in this case it's fine. We also have the Beast Hunter down here at ground level, kind of behind this building's nook, able to move out as required, but mostly just kind of a defensive piece / irregular. It'll do something later in the game. For my part, as mentioned, everything is deploying quite conservatively. The Suryat Kaitok Dartok team will be deployed in amongst these buildings. The Suryat itself, you can probably just barely see there's a sign up against the table edge. It's deployed in behind that. The Kaitok is more forwardly positioned, able to put chain rifles down, kind of at anything that might be pushing through my deployment zone. And then the Dartok is up on this rooftop, a bit further back. The Dadarazi is here, ready to run out and impetuous and throw smoke kind of as needed if I think I need to, or I can just stay there and be deployment zone DZ. The Ikadron is here to be a repeater. It will be available to reload things if needed, but that's not going to come up this game. The missile bot is relatively far back. It will move forward over the course of the game, but right now it's just in this hidden nook back here. The Combat Group 2, Yaogat, and Dartok team are deployed up against and on the rooftop of this building. And then finally, the 2 other fire teams, the Osnat Gaki, they are on ground level, hanging out behind this rather large barricade here. And then the Rodok are on the rooftop of this barricade. Now, there's no easy way down off of these, except if you have super jump, which means there is a very easy way down off of these. This is a fairly safe position for them to go. They're going to be very difficult to assault, except if something is able to really get all the way up there. And if my opponent is doing that on the first turn of an unmasking scenario, well, they can go ahead and have those relatively limited kills. I am going to go after the mission. So, safe Rodok deployment. Now, after a bunch of looking at my DZ and going, you're not putting anything on hard ARO. No, I'm not. I know what your reserve is. The Jotun comes down here. giving it a nice dominant position over about half of the battlefield. Because of that large central terrain, right, its line of sight is going to be cut off kind of like that, but it will still have pretty dominant position over anything I might put on ARO. And because the Jotun, it's blocked, it can see about half of my sort of like high ground terrain. The Soggerat drops down on this rooftop over here, where it is in position, firstly to block Lang Kai's impetuous move, should Lang Kai advance, but more importantly, where it will take a bunch of movement for the Jotun to get to it if it wants to do anything. The Jotun has orders to spend, right? It has, I want to say, 7 orders that it might potentially be able to spend, 5 in its combat group, plus tactical awareness, plus lieutenant. But that is not an unlimited number. And if I can force it into a position where it needs to move several times to even see the standing Soggerat, it will only have so many chances to attack the Soggerat before it has to decide between entrenching where it is and pulling back. And particularly given there's no chain of command in this list, right? There's only one chain of command available in Winter 4, and it's Hannibal, who you can take, but he qualifies as a bit of a vanity pick. Keeping the Jotun alive is very important. Loss of Lieutenant is not a fun time for this list. It's reliant on like fire teams, and it has a lot of auto-generating cheerleaders that become very useless when you enter Loss of Lieutenant. And so, because the Jotun really wants to sweep a few things and then pull back to safety, if, for example, it was to move all the way up here and then onto this rooftop to engage the Soggerat, that would be multiple orders that it would then have to decide if it wants to stay there or pull back. And so I'm quite happy with the defensive position of this Soggerat. It would also be difficult for the Jotun to move up onto this rooftop. It would be exposed in the open, taking a face-to-face roll probably at longer than 32 inches. And that's one of the other circumstances under which the Soggerat can feasibly match the Jotun at long range, because the Soggerat has a Feuerback, which has a 0 range band beyond 32. If I can flip the script and have the Jotun be at -3, me at 0, and then also have the Jotun out of cover before entering the first face-to-face roll, it really doesn't want to make that fight. And so I'm quite happy with the Soggerat's position, and indeed, it's going to put a crimp on my opponent's first turn. Now, it's a bit of a choice over who to strip orders from, but I ultimately make the decision that it's going to be challenging enough for the Jotun to relocate based on the Soggerat's position that I want to strip orders from their first combat group. The first combat group is what they will undoubtedly be used to doing the mission. And so I want it to be in a position where it can't, particularly where if it wants to, especially go after a HVT, it's going to have to leave assets for me to gobble up. Now, my opponent nevertheless plays basically as clean a first turn as you will ever see with SWF. The first thing that he does is he assesses how to get to the Soggerat. He determines that there are 2 possible routes. He discards the idea of going onto this rooftop because doing so would put the Jotun in a position where it wouldn't be able to pull back. And so he does what is absolutely the correct thing, which is that he strafes up the deployment zone to get a position that is still in his DZ and therefore safe. I actually wasn't sure where he'd move it or what he would see. This is absolutely the right call. And so the movement path for the Jotun is to jump down here and then move, and then move and take the fight, ending up against the wall against this building, still in the deployment zone, still in a relatively safe position. Now that still takes 2 orders, leaving the Jotun with 5. And what he finds is that thanks to how far back the Soggerat is in my deployment zone, this is still a bad range face-to-face roll. The first exchange actually inflicts a wound on the Jotun as a result, but the Jotun then moves forward to get into good range. It's able to hug up against this building wall and still have cover, and we have another face-to-face roll that is inconclusive. Now, that's 4 of 7 orders spent. We have the face-to-face roll again. That's 5 of 7. And at this point, the Jotun actually lands a barrage of hits, but the Soggerat's armor holds, and it takes a wound. Now, I consider whether I want to guts at this point. I decide that I do. The Soggerat decides that it does not, and it stays in position. That is the nature of having a religious troop army. But at this point, the Jotun is getting very close to, it's going to have to take many more gunfights and still have some orders left to withdraw back to a totally safe position. It would need to spend command tokens. My opponent has set aside 1 command token already for Speedball. He's cognizant of the fact that those command tokens are a relatively precious resource in PanOceania with its dumb-ass engineers. And so he pulls back the Jotun with this face-to-face roll to a position in cover here, taking a face-to-face roll on the way out as he goes, but again, it is inconclusive, and the Soggerat holds. This is like just kind of an everyone with a bat situation. Could very easily have had a case where the Soggerat went down there, which is why I wanted it to drop prone, but this is going to be one of those games where the Soggerat shows his quality. Now, after all of this movement, back and forth, etc., the Yoda will end up in this position here. There is potentially one order, a Warcore order at this juncture that could be turned from irregular into regular, but my opponent decides to keep that irregular, that particularly the command token, in his back pocket. He would rather have it. If he goes down to 2 and I possess the Yotum, then he's going to go down to 1. I could keep doing that, etc. And especially if he wants to re-roll any engineering rolls, just decides to keep it and keep it there. Now, this is an interesting choice, because if we break the math down on this, the Yotum is stopping me from advancing up this corridor until I deal with it. And the Soggerat is, if it moves to engage it, the Soggerat can see it by leaning out over the building, engaging it at a 0 range band for the Soggerat, a -3 for the Yotum. Under those circumstances, it's quite likely that the Yotum, most likely is the Yotum survives. It dodges reasonably well against the Soggerat, or it can just shoot back on 5s. And if the goal is basically to suck down some of my orders, perfectly serviceable. It is still, however, something of a risk, is a risk my opponent is choosing to take, but they transition into playing just a very clean first order group activation, which is 100% the Locust Song and Dance. A combination of coordinated orders and regular orders sees both Locusts move up very cleanly. One of them comes up onto this rooftop and gets towards this objective. The other one moves towards this objective. And after just a couple of orders, now the reason why he's doing 2 of these is that he has a couple of different lines on different HVTs. And if he can, he wants to get the kill on the real HVT this turn. Doing that at this stage, like premeditating that, does require moving both of these Varg forward, which necessitates the coordinated order. Part of that is why he was reluctant to spend the irregular order on the Warcore to move the Jotun back. Gets both of the Varg into range of the objectives, and in fact the first one presses the button on this objective on the top part of the screen, and tragically reveals there's a HVT of mine around here, reveals it, and it is the real one. It's the one that I didn't choose. I rolled a D3 because I'd forgotten to choose at deployment. I do that sometimes, in fact a lot, and whenever that happens, randomly roll. Usually what will happen is I will be finishing my deployment and I'll go, oh crap, give me a second, and then I'll just roll a D3. You should really play the scenario properly, but I actually have gotten into the habit in Unmasking of just randomizing anyway, because it means I can't trip myself up with a like, I'm being really clever, I'll double bluff this. Oh, he just picked it anyway. And so he reveals that one, it is the real one immediately, and the Locust goes after and assassinates it. So that's a tasty like 3 points in Unmasking for my opponent immediately. Has a couple of thing orders still left to spend, and so those are spent moving this Locust up to here, pressing this button, getting it picked, just revealing this HVT over here so he can kill it later on, obviously as the decoy, and then importantly, cyber masking, right? Because that Locust has been revealed, he gets it back into a marker state. It is a weak marker state because it's easier to discover than basically anything else because of negative feedback with the Locust Mimetism 6, but gets the Locust into that position there and passes turn back to me. Overall, hasn't done any damage to me, but he has accomplished the single most important thing you can accomplish in this scenario, which is to identify and kill the real HVT. Now, for my part, when you encounter this situation in Unmasking, and Lord knows that I have many times, right, where you play Unmasking, your opponent goes first, and they get the kill that is most important right off the bat, but doing so requires them to spend their turn. My approach to the scenario is, okay, this is now a 3-turn game of attrition where I am playing the long game. The win condition now from me is to not just match you on HVT kills, but play out turn 2, like turn 1, turn 2, and turn 3, whittle away your resources, and then win on most buttons pressed and all of the civilians killed, because that is still a convincing win in this scenario. And so to accomplish that, cool, we are playing Attrition for this first turn. Datarazi is going to Impetuous, he'll end up in the open a little bit, but not exposed to any particular risk, and he will throw a very precisely calculated smoke grenade. Now, when you're throwing smoke, you pick the impact position, you don't get to finagle the template, but I got out my laser, I drew a laser basically down this line to make sure that I would have all of the shots that I wanted, then I eyeballed where the smoke would go, and where the smoke would have to go is basically up against this wall here, protruding kind of out like that, such that I could still draw lines down here if I needed to, but could do some other movement first with various pieces without the Yotum interfering. If it had failed, no worries, we just change the order in which we do certain things, but very carefully, and it's the first time I think I've ever had to do that, where I've had to get the laser out and then pick a point on the table, just to be playing smoke properly. With that smoke down, the Kaitok is then covered to just peek around the corner, stare at the Locust. The Locust's Bang Bomb does not work against the Kaitok's chain rifles, and the Locust is well aware of that. If the Locust elects to dodge, he will just cop a bunch of pistols at short range, so he shoots. He shoots in the hope of wounding the Kaitok. The Kaitok lights him up with his chain rifles, and the Kaitok actually spangs the Breaker Rifle save. Cool, one Locust down, let's carry on. The next thing to do is firstly to deal with the Warcore up here. So we have the Locust kill, no problem. The Sogarat's going to spend its Lieutenant order, dial in on the War Correspondent, and 3 shots hitting on 13s. The Warcore is hitting on like virtually nothing at that particular range. Boom, 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 clean as you like, down goes the War Correspondent. The Sogarat is then going to lean out to get line of sight to the enemy Yotum, and at this point it is revealed that my apparent curse when it comes to flagship PanOceanian tags is contagious, because my opponent, he actually likes to shoot because the shot could kill, tries to roll a 5, doesn't get it, and I roll a 6, a 7, and a 9, all of which are hits, and the Yotum goes down. Now, it's not dead, but a second barrage will see to that, and that comfortably locks in not just the most powerful gun in my opponent's list down for the count, but also a turn of loss of Lieutenant, which is going to let us fairly comfortably ride out much of the rest of this game. In terms of other things we have to do this turn, we are going to push forward with the Kaitok and the Dartok. We have to leave the Suryat behind, but we'll pick him up later. We're going to press this button ourselves, reveal an enemy HVT back here, and then swing back. The Kaitok will kill it along the way, and the 2 fire team members will move back to a position where the Suryat can rejoin them at end of turn. And then the Rodok Thunderbolt will stand up to declare a Discover against the enemy Locust in Cybermask. He will fail the Discover roll, which means I then have to get a whole bunch of orders spent moving this Link team forward just to have something to declare Discover, but they do it, and I think 3 orders later, against a combination of Bang Bomb dodging and Breaker Rifle shots back, the Rodok Thunderbolt puts down the Locust. Now, apart from that, we just do a little bit of movement forward. We move the Rodok team forward to stage them, but overall, that is a very, very solid turn. We've got 1 button pressed back to our side. We've killed a decoy, but that's still progress that we need to make, and more importantly, we have blown out a huge portion of our opponent's army. Lankai is still pinned down. He can't advance under fire of the Sogarat. And with the Yotum dead, my opponent will be spending a turn of loss of Lieutenant. Now, there is the question in, was it correct or incorrect for the Yotum to stay where it was? It's honestly kind of a good question, and I think there would be like several alternate universes where I hadn't gotten lucky and we wouldn't even be having the conversation, where the Yotum maybe would just have spent a couple of rounds shooting back, pass some armor saves, because it does still have, even against armor-piercing double-action rounds, it's got very good armor, right? It fails on only something like 14s. I think it only needs 14s to pass against incoming back hits. It could very easily have gone the distance and wasted a bunch of my time. However, what happened instead was that the worst possible outcome materialized, and that outcome was catastrophic. And that is something that you need to consider when you are assessing risks like this. Now, notwithstanding the grim nature of the turn he's just been subjected to, my opponent has some plays that he can make. This will require spending command tokens that he's got, but the main thing that's going to happen, and the main kind of mistake that I have made, is that I have elected to leave this Yaugat that had to move forward to discover the Locust over here and see to the Locust's death, even though I think the discovery roll for the Rodok was like on 16s, because it was in a 2-person link, so yeah, only on 13s is what it is. The Yaugat has been left standing rather than prone. And because he's been left standing rather than prone, I have left him in a position where a Varg with albedo -6, I will remind you, as part of a link team, is able to jump up here, take those 3 rockets, and clean as you like end the life of the Yaugat. Now, that is basically all that can be accomplished this turn. Lankai is not really in a position where he can safely move forward, so the rest of the orders that kind of are available, noting that there really aren't many because of loss of Lieutenant, are going to be spent moving the Beast Hunter forward just up and around to here, because my opponent is aware of what my win condition is, and one of the things he can do is set up to guard his HVTs, which he does by moving and then moving and placing a mine, just to protect this HVT of his over here. Now, that passes forward to my second turn, and I am quite able to put the boot in at this point. because of the orders that we still have available and the staging that we've got, and especially because there at this point there is nothing I really need my combat group to do at this juncture. I am instead just going to use the orders I have available to pull this Dartok back a little bit. Once it's in a safe position, not in line of sight of the Varga, it's going to spend a couple more orders hocking pitches down and landing them there. And at that point, as I move fire teams forward, I can just be making spotlight rolls. And indeed, after I think a couple more orders, we spotlight and kill the Varg. Now, could I potentially have taken that fight with the Thunderbolt Rodok? Yes, absolutely. That would have been a fine enough face-to-face roll, but because we had the spare orders in Combat Group 2, it's a reasonable thing to do. The bulk of the rest of the orders that will be spent this turn will be on the Rodok team, moving up and around here. They are going to press this button, reveal this HVT, send the Krakot Renegade in, and after a few face-to-face rolls, the Krakot Renegade will die, but so will the Beast Hunter and the HVT, and I will deal with the mine. So boom, 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 clear through all of that, and otherwise we're just going to move forward and we're going to stage things. Okay, at this point we have determined that the sole remaining HVT of my opponents, this one here, is the real one, but if we get that kill in my opponent's turn, in my turn 3, we have the game neatly stitched up. There are a bunch of pitches that have been placed out. We are reasonably well positioned. The big lad, the Sogarat Tempest Regiment, is still comfortably in ARO, and my opponent just doesn't have a whole ton of resources left. Now, he's going to do what he can, and what he can in this case is make use of the fact that he does still have a Disco Ball and Shona Carano, and so all remaining orders this turn are going to be spent on this effort. The fire team that still exists here is going to move out in this direction, up and around. It's going to get some Disco Smoke down. There will be some dodges, but they will not be sufficient to stop, and then up and through this direction. Ultimately, what is going to happen, I think Shona Carano actually gets crash tackled by one of the Rodok, but there is still, at this juncture, a very clean line of play, which is just to get the remaining Varga, who is not in melee, out and around this way, draw a line of sight in on the HVT over here. It's not the real one because my opponent has already killed the real one, but put it down. That is the remainder of my opponent's turn here, and noting that there is no picture of turn 3 on my side, you can basically guess what is going to happen. The Rodok team will continue to be the heroes of the day at this particular point. They're going to dive up and over this direction into this building here where this button can be pressed. Press that button, which will reveal this HVT. Now, at that point, it will actually take something like I think it takes like 4 orders for the Thunderbolt shooting the damn thing out of cover to put it down, but put it down it does. It's the real HVT. It's the only kill that I need to score this turn, and killing it gets me. End of the game, I have the real HVT killed. I have not protected my own, but I've killed the real one, so has my opponent. I've killed more decoys, I've killed both decoys, and I have more buttons pressed, which in Unmasking is a reasonably clean 8-4 win to Morat Aggression Force. Overall, very enjoyable game, really wonderful, clean, well-executed first turn by my opponent. One risk that he took ultimately came back and bit him very badly in a very catastrophic way when the Sogarat Tempest Regiment finally decided to live up to its regiment's name. But I have been getting reps in with Morats. I've been playing a few different games with them. This is the point where the list has really finally clicked together, and I was very happy to have played this game. I will be playing more Morats. I have a number of Morats I need to paint to get the collection up to spec in N5. But I am happy to report that they remain a very enjoyable and flexible faction, and this was a great game. Just as a reminder and quick channel plug, if you like the video, please like it. If you're not subscribed, please do consider subscribing to the channel. We put videos out weekly, including taking requests from channel supporters. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description for one-off donations, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. There are 3 different levels of support for the channel. But in all 3 cases, what I take are I will take requests from channel supporters for battle reports, video topics, etc. They will go into the big long list. It is a big long list of stuff to do, but I do try and eventually get to everything if I can. Whether that is video topics that I can reasonably do, battle reports or armies that I can reasonably cover, faction focuses that I can attend to. As always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.